I'm excited to welcome you to this panel discussion, which expands some of the ideas presented in the current exhibition, Christopher Paul Jordan and Arnaldo James, In the Interim, Ritual Ground for a Future Black Archive. Our 5 speakers will discuss the nuances of diasporic Blackness through their own individual and collective experiences as they relate to the making of a future Black archive. Central to the discussion, as it is to the exhibition, is The Interim, a soundproof chamber into which visions and prefigurations of Black futures are being recorded by the public. Our guest speakers will query the artists' motivations in light of their various diasporic affiliations, Washington State on the one hand, and the island nation of Trinidad and Tobago on the other. The discussion will close around further considerations of In the Interim and its planned second iteration in Port of Spain. So with that, I'll introduce In the Interim's curator, Claire Tancons, who can in turn introduce our panelists and get the conversation started. Claire is a curator, writer, and researcher invested in the post-colonial politics of art production and exhibition. She publishes for and speaks at artistic and academic venues, as well as teaches. She was the inaugural Mellon Global Curatorial Professor at the Graduate Center, City University of New York in 2020, and a visiting professor for the curatorial workshop at the School of Visual Art in 2021. Notable curatorial projects include the Traveling Project en Masse, Carnival and Performance Art of the Caribbean, and Uphill Down Hall at the Tate Modern. Long based in New Orleans and recently settled in Paris, Tancons has curated for numerous international biennials, including those in New Orleans, Gwangju, Benin, Gothenburg, and most recently, Sharjah. She is currently at work on the book Roadworks, Processional Performance in the New Millennium. Welcome, Claire. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Manda. And it's really my great pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon, Washington State time, this evening, Port of Spain time, and tonight, Paris time. So 2 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 5 or 6 o'clock, and 11 p.m., hence the darkness surrounding me. Now, I do not want to make of this Zoom interface through which we're connecting more than just that, the fact that we're having a virtual conversation, but I'm wondering if we're not already somehow within the space of what a diasporic conversation is, finding ways to bridge the distance through time and space within which we have found ourselves splintered across the ocean. And certainly my relationship to, I would say, at least 3 of our guests, the artists themselves, Arnaldo, Chris, and also Marsha, somehow finds its sea rather than ground through these diasporic connections that we have somehow found, but also teased out and maintained over, I think, Marsha, 2 decades, even though we haven't been in touch recently, but literally we've known each other, or we first encountered each other 2 decades ago at least, and Arnaldo, Chris, and I somewhat more recently, but still within the decade kind of a range. And so it's really primary to me that we begin to query what is the relationship between the archive on the one hand and the ritual on the other hand. And in many ways, although it may seem that Chris has been tending more specifically to notions of archiving the Black experience, and mayhap Arnaldo more so the ways in which ritual proceedings can emerge thereof, both very much respond to each of these dynamics. And I think it would be interesting to hear from each of them how they have unpacked these notions respectively within their works, but also jointly as the wonderful team they have formed, and from which I will exclude myself for now, leaving it to you to bear the full responsibility of what you have put out in the world. Chris, you want to begin? You said you had things to share with us.
Yeah, I mean, first I just have to say, oh my gosh, hello to all the loved ones that are here. It's such a blessing just seeing your names in the list. Oh my gosh, I wish I could see your faces because I know that we would be making messes right now together. But it's really just, it's a blessing to connect with everyone together in this space. Oh my gosh, Claire, you couldn't be, I think, more right. When it comes to my whole journey in painting, I guess, started, I would say, in this iteration of it, started in Trinidad. You know, I was a student for the first time having Black professors, you know, for the first time painting with brushes and having just a totally different experience of like culture and history and community. And where I really want to start, and I know Arnaldo's going to be a little bit frustrated with me for this, maybe, I'm not sure, because I always do this, but I want to start just by sharing the first work of Arnaldo's that I saw. Can everyone see this on the screen now? So I was literally flying into the country, you know, and sitting in the plane, and before me is resting, you know, Caribbean Beat magazine. And I'm flipping through the magazine, just trying to get a grasp of like, where am I going? What is this gonna be like? And I see this image. And to me, the same kind of call that I feel when I'm making my own work, that's the call that I felt in seeing this image, that Arnaldo's work literally beckoned me. And there's something about these images, there's something about this moment and this memory which said to me, you need to go to where this is. You need to find where this is where the work is happening, you need to be there. And so kind of my journey of, you know, studying at University of West Indies, of meeting artists, was all this kind of long circuitous route of finding my way to Arnaldo. I didn't expect that we would become best friends or like family now. I had no clue how to expect, you know, how meeting him would really drastically change my life. But over, you know, the ensuing, I guess we're not quite to a decade, but we're getting there. Connecting with Arnaldo has been one of the most transformative experiences of my life. And we have been using these little exhibitions back and forth between Tacoma and Port of Spain and Arima and Seattle as ways of connecting, as ways of keeping in touch. I think as ways of re-encountering, and what I feel like is, you know, resuming conversations which have been interrupted by colonization, by borders, by dislocation and displacement. I feel that we're resuming conversations that we were having before these separations had taken place. And so I don't know if you want to talk all about where these images come from or to lead from there or move from there at all, but I just had to share with everyone this really incredible work.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I just want to briefly say hi to everyone who is tuning in and will be watching later. And thank you to everyone who's on the panel and everyone behind the scenes at the Fry. Quickly into this. So these images, I was working on supporting Robert Young's band, Core Vulgar Fraction. And so he designed these costumes and set up this in a space that's called Alice Yard, which has been like instrumental and to this, you know, from the earliest parts of my career to now, I continue to have these interventions with this necessary space, which is Alice Yard. I mean, I'm trying to reflect on even the day of shooting this. My practice is typically collaborative. And so I'm usually sitting with people and trying to get to know them in the moment. Sometimes it's really quick, sometimes it's over a more prolonged period. And yeah, trying to make something new. Is there anything specific you want me to speak to, Chris?
Well, I think it just it's incredible to me because this work really changed my life, and initiated this thing called Vigils of Ourselves Undead, which was, I think, a first like small exhibition that we did, collaborate with Chimera or Charles Bailey. So it just, to me, it's like the beginning of this eruption of this like unfurling of these different experiments. And also your work with Rodell Warner, and this really beautiful, just really life-changing images for me. There's a feeling of being suspended, not only outside of time, but in response with Claire's question about ritual. There's a sort of a dimension that your work carries me into. There's a space of suspense. There's another arena of mind that I feel like I'm entering when I'm encountering your work. And I just kind of wanted to start the conversation by marking this dialogue, because when people talk to me about inverted images and things like that, and I have to always again credit that inspiration is coming from collaborations with you. And so the colored exhibition, with this kind of immersive murals, inverted murals, and this gathering of artists from the US and Caribbean in Tacoma, I feel like we have just been trying to find ways of, again, resume these conversations and using the exhibition space really just as an experimental ground for dialogue, for community. And so, yeah, I guess, Claire, like that's kind of like my kind of like answer to the thing is like, there's important questions that I think when it comes to, a lot of people talk about like back to Africa movements. And I know that you've done really incredible work in conversation with that history. And something that I've always found really important, particularly because of that, like how my experience in Trinidad changed my life, was that I think that the way back is through our shared post-Middle Passage community. That there's memories, knowledge, awareness, histories that we hold. There's wholeness that assembles, that collides, that manifests in our resonance across the hemisphere. Things that are held and that can only be gained through resuming conversations with one another. And for me, that's something I can just never get enough of. So it's just, yeah, it just keeps growing. And now we're here.
Thank you. I am Chris and Arnaldo. I am torn because I want to chip in and briefly maybe enlighten or remind our audience as to how do I fit into into this scheme, and I will try to do so briefly. And that with which I am also torn is whom will I then ask to speak first between Marsha and Bettina, and for various reasons. But we'll get to that. But very quickly, because all these good memories that you shared about meeting in Trinidad reminds me of my own diasporic journey to Guadeloupe and then really to Trinidad, which is where I found myself as a Caribbean woman. And lo and behold, of course, Chris, I saw the colored exhibition in Tacoma, that for which I nominated you for an Eddie Arts Award way back, maybe not yet, yes, 10, 10 years ago. And then Arnaldo, I can't quite recall when exactly is the first time we met, but I know when last we were in presence in Port of Spain, and that was indeed at Aliciard, or rather at, what is the name of the other space? The other space of Aliciard. Yes, you know. Thank you. Yes. And then, of course, it was for photographs around Marlon Griffith's processional performance, etc. But I won't go into this. But from Trinidad to Chris and back to you in Trinidad, this is how our own little circulation of diasporic blackness occurred. And it's not too late for those of you who have been following us for a good 15 minutes already, or those who are joining in now. We are at on speaking about the archive in terms of the past and the future. Archiving the future, diasporic blackness, then and now. And I think that, Chris, you know, you have kept on reminding us about how we are trying to find ways to rekindle what you very poetically refer to as our post-Middle Passage experience. And within that, the spatial-temporal realm within which we find ourselves can only but be referred to as always ever but a return and a move forward and towards both the past and the future. And so this, you know, maelstrom in and of itself calls for rituals of harnessing that to which we once feel we belong, and constantly try to continue making sure we are belonging to, despite the separations, and that which we aspire to become, because obviously our becoming still is ahead of us. And so, having said that, I think I want to go on to, well, whomever one of the two of you, Marsha or Bettina, would like to speak. I'm tempted to query Bettina, because I was rereading for myself, but I should for the audience, your brief bio, and I was stuck on this word and notion of feeling, which you are developing within your current book manuscript, but specifically as related to Afrofeminism or Black women experience. But I want to hear from you, Bettina, how this notion of feeling might apply and work through the current dispositive of works between Chris and Arnaldo, but also just quickly, just to give credit to who you are and how you have made your own journey to us, Bettina. I will quickly read, as Amanda kindly did for me, the very beginning introduction of your biography. And so, Bettina, you are at once an interdisciplinary writer, artist, and performer whose research focus is on Black women's creative production and our use of visual art, literature, and music to develop feminist thought. And your current book argues that Black women creative production is feminist knowledge production produced by registers of affect you call feeling. And so I'm wondering how you can somehow repossess this feminine notion of feeling through the works of our two gentlemen here present.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that intro. And I will say a joyous update to this bio. I am now Associate Professor of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Washington. So I got tenure. But
Congratulations.
Thank you. So I absolutely the way that I talk about feeling, and this is my forthcoming book. It's coming out of Northwestern University Press at the end of this year. It's called Feeling Creative Practice, Pleasure in Black Feminist Thought. And I do use it in conversation with Black women artists specifically. And I deign to, it is not only something or a way to understand Black women's creative production. Specifically, it is a diasporically shaped practice, right? And so this is why I use this term feeling, as it draws from Black idioms of English, of speaking in English, right? And that use of the term feeling is, it has particular meaning for the speakers of these languages, right? That it's not, you can say I'm feeling that, and you're not necessarily saying I'm touching something. You're saying that I am experiencing it through a kind of knowledge, right? And so I think definitely, as I look at this wonderful exhibit and what the idea of this exhibit as an archive of the future is telling us, it is tapping into some of that knowledge. It's tapping into a way of seeing, like, oh, I absolutely know what this is referring to in a kind of past present dimension of Black experience and identity through the kind of diasporic connection, through the diasporic relation, right? And that feeling, I think, is absolutely what is shaping like this project, like that I can witness to costume, to the way the camera, the shutter of the lens creates a scene, to the very specter and meaning of water in space, for Black diasporic folks, and know what is being communicated to me. It is not just strange shapes and shadows. It has particular meaning. And so when we connect it through, and those meanings, are these are not the same images that I'm seeing. These are not the same shapes that I'm seeing, but each and every one of them together, I'm feeling that. Like it creates, it lets me know that a story is being told that I'm already familiar with, and I want to know more about why am I familiar with this thing. Right. So the previous image that you showed, like the painting by Christopher with this desk, this familiar, these familiar things, right, in this landscape, these familiar objects in this landscape, and then in this corner here, the meeting of these costumes in the shore, those two images together in this context has meaning for me as a person of African descent who went to public schools, who had a relationship to the land, who knows my relationship to land and water in a historical context and in a present context, and knows my relations, even if I do not know my relations. I just met Arnaldo today for the first time, and Marsha, and you, Claire, too, but I know my folks through these images and the experience of these images. And as much as they are unfamiliar to me, they are quite familiar, and I know I belong to them, right? And so that is kind of the essence of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about feeling. I'm talking about the ways that specifically, I'm talking about the ways that Black women artists produce the kind of knowledge. They think through their creative process through these kinds of registers of feeling, even if they're uncomfortable, even if they're distant, even if they're painful, maybe because they are painful. And they might come to some very difficult and messed up conclusions, right? It's not all good, touchy-feely, yummy, yummy. Like sometimes it's quite damaging and terrible. But they tell us something. right? And so I would say thank you for asking that question, because speaking it out loud allowed me to think through how even those concepts can be in conversation with Jordan and James here.
Thank you so much, Bettina, for this brilliant expansion upon your work and as it applies to Chris and Arnaldo's. And I think that we couldn't phrase better the way in which we are all feeling, as you say, recognizing that which we know we've known all along, that which we care not to forget ever, and that which each and every one of us members of the diaspora who cares to uphold that historical, that diasporic historical consciousness, make sure to remind each other through this network of sign that, as we know, best travels through water and its mnemonic qualities. So thank you very much, Bettina. And this naturally prompts me to turn to Marsha, who is also in Trinidad. In which city are you? Are you in Port of Spain, Marsha, or elsewhere?
No, I'm in the East.
You're in the East.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, in the East. Okay. And so the fact that you couldn't quite get together and be in the same room, and we're really all quite so distant. Marsha, it's lovely to see you again after all these years. Having followed, though, as I have, all of what you've been up to, and I will maybe read the beginning and the end of your biography and leave it up to you to give us the most updated information, as Bettina did. So, Marsha Pearce, Dr. Marsha Pearce, you're a scholar, an educator, and a curator based in Trinidad and Tobago. You hold a BA in visual arts and a PhD in cultural studies. You're a lecturer and visual arts unit coordinator in the Department of Creative and Festival Arts at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. Is it still current, Marsha?
That's
yes,
correct. That's
yes,
correct.
Wonderful, yes. And you've done so much curatorial and editorial work, but maybe that which most characterized your recent work has been the series of conversation you led while in quarantine, very simply titled Quarantine and Art. Is there anything you'd like to add in between, or maybe let's take it from there? And also, actually, much as I promised Arnaldo yesterday that I was not going to belabor the whole COVID pandemic at too great of a length, but our friend Chris is like bending backward, laughing like it's no big deal. But you're supposed to be in quarantine, aren't you? Are you out of the quarantine?
Yesterday I just finished. Yeah, yesterday I finished.
Okay, it's good to be able to laugh about it, and we'll go back to you, Marsha, but I do want to say something about what this whole COVID situation does to us, Black folk, and the way in which this also played a role in the further thinking around this archive, but also around the making of the show and also of this very panel. But Marsha, please.
Thank you, Claire. That sums me up well. That's fine. Thank you. And of course, in referencing, the whole series Q&A, which I call Q&A Quarantine and Art, I really set out to consider the well-being of the arts community. The whole notion of community was very important to me, wanting to connect across the seas, as you so beautifully opened in terms of thinking about our locatedness. And so the whole idea of community was important to me, as we moved into this pandemic and found ourselves isolated, having to socially distance and so on. I wanted to hear from us. I wanted to hear from each other. And so this idea of community is important. And I think it shows up so richly in the interim. And that is what resonates for me with this exhibition. The whole idea of diaspora is not only about dislocation or rupture, it's also about affiliations. It's about relationships, connectivity. And so for me, what I find so exciting about this show is the way voice shows up in visual and sonic relationships, so that you have Christopher's paintings and Arnaldo's photographs. There's that visual dimension, but there's also the sonic dimension. There's that oral dimension. At the very center, there is that recording booth that allows audiences to come in and to give their perspectives. And I feel that in adding that dimension, and of course, it allows us to think again about how is that related to the visual modality of our communication. But it also has me thinking about what Camel Bradford calls total expression. And I'm thinking I want to refer to his book, which is called His History of the Voice. And in that, as I said, he refers to this thing called total expression. And he says, reading can be an isolated expression. But as I quote, the oral tradition, on the other hand, demands not only the griot or the storyteller, but the audience to complete the community. The noise and sounds that the maker makes are responded to by the audience. Hence, we have the creation of a continuum where meaning truly resides, end quote. And I find that so significant for thinking through this exhibition and thinking, as I said, about ideas of community and the way the exhibition sets up this continuum for the making of Black meanings. And so, again, as I said, that is what really strikes me, the idea of affiliation and a sense of openness in the exhibition that allows us to move away from Blackness in terms of a fixity, but allows us to see it in terms of its breadth and its depth.
Thank you, Marsha, for bringing in this most important dimension of community, which is, I guess, at the very center of Chris's concern, first and foremost, with this a recording booth, which you refer to. And thank you, Marsha, for putting it back at the center of the discussion, as it is at the center of the exhibition. I do want to pause a little bit on that, though, if only because it is that which, from the documentation, we are and will forever be deprived of. For as we know, yes, you can laugh, Chris, for as we know, as I said, you're going to take responsibility for what you did. For as we know, the recordings will be sealed for the foreseeable future, 100 years, no less. And so, of course, that we're missing, but I am hoping that some of those who are following this conversation were recording participants in the exhibition, or eavesdroppers for those who were not so privileged as to being able to enter the recording booth. So I want to return to the sonic and to the voice, but to pick up from what you said, Marsha, about the diasporic continuum aesthetically. From what I can gather, and from what all of those who saw the exhibition or are now seeing the documentation of the exhibition can gather, there's a very interesting photographic lens throughout both, of course, Arnaldo's and Chris's work, but it is a lens which is inverted indeed, specifically as concerns Chris, but it's the lens of the inward eye. It's the lens of the ghostly eye. It's the lens of, I want to and luckily I cannot do it because I am not undead just yet, but it is this eye that goes to the back of the ocular cavity, and that we know is already the eye of a return. And I think that, Chris, you express through this inversion, this photo to painting via the cell phone technology inversion. And Chris, of course, that is also something that you operate not so literally, but by way of the very reflections and the way in which you capture the light. And I also remember, Arnaldo, that some of the references through which you worked, even though again they did not transform into literal applications, if you will, were underwater photographs, right? And so with the, in between Chrissy's inverted photograph and your underwater landscape, even though you did not actually take underwater photograph, but I know that you are in that space of, the aftermath of the passage. And so I wanted to go back to this notion of a continuum aesthetically, if only from a visual standpoint, bereft though we are of the sonic component. I don't know, Bettina, if this is also something that you feel resonates with the notion of feeling now in a mayhap more tangible way, or at least through a kind of a visual prehension.
And maybe, Bettina, as you come in on this, I know Claire, you're wanting to talk around the interim piece, but I kind of want to, I think it's helpful to bring it up in a way, sure, because I think particularly within just the lineage of Black feminist thought, of practice and world making, really the genesis of this project for me was Zora Neale Hurston, and her practice, her ethnographic practice, her practice as a memory holder. And the book Barracoon, The Last Black Cargo, which came out, a few years ago, which was essentially a time capsule, right? And Bettina, I'm super interested in your thoughts on this, because essentially, Zora's politic was that she insisted on that text having its integrity to the vernacular in which it was documented. This story of the last known living survivor of the transatlantic trafficking, which she archived in that text, in his words, and really insisted that it be published that way, inadvertently formed a time capsule, in the sense that the publishing industry wouldn't publicize, wouldn't distribute a story that was written, that was encoded in our voice, in our language. And so just thinking about your ways and your ideas about feeling, thinking about the kinds of knowledges that are passed down body to body, person to person, through the space of knowing that you're centering your practice around. I'm really interested in this, all of this ideas and history that live in a sort of a pocket dimension outside of the timeline, mainstream time space that we are always inundated with and always being barraged with, and what kinds of memory and knowledge is stored in the spirit, essentially. But thinking about Zora's insistence on that as forming a protective shell around a history that we're blessed to have encountered today intact, and thinking about her whole experience. I don't know, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about how Black feminist lineage of practice, that how memory is formed and passed on in the spirit from generation to generation.
Thank you for that kind of question. I was trying to formulate initially this idea of the archive that you and Arnaldo are working with in this exhibit, and how it documents some actually quite frightening things that, and by that I mean like water right now is is a frightening thought in this moment in which sea levels are rising, islands are facing and coastal areas are facing particular forms of devastation. And so in many ways, we are in the kind of, if I can like borrow from June Jordan, expecting apocalypse, right? And she talks about that in her collection, We're the Ones Who Did Not Die. And so there is this thing, I think that's very true for someone like Hurston, who who imagined apocalyptic events in, say, the novel Her Eyes Are Watching God, and who also did this really important work of collecting and archiving Black diasporic history and culture and practices, and honoring forms of Black culture and language that we thought, the greater we folks thought was discardable and of no value. And so I think about the tension between those two things, right? Like if there is a tension, this expecting the end of the world and also preserving the current, the present for a memory towards a future, right? That happens at the same kind of time. And I do think that there is a curious tendency in the work in that sense, is to expect, to want for, to mandate the end of the current world in order for there to actually be a future. And that absolutely is terrifying, because oneself may not make it, right? like I myself, everyone in this Zoom space might not make it, but the imagination that someone who needs it could be on the other side is so very much a part of this practice, and is the archive, right? Is the archive that is ritual, that speaks to what you were saying, Chris, about things being passed down in the spirit, right? Like these are the things that cannot be stolen. They can beat many things out of you. They can physically steal things from you. There is a lore, like it's not a lore as in false, but there is a thing within my family about our own archive. My great grandmother's home in Warrenton, North Carolina, was mysteriously burned down. And some objects that was in that house appeared at various antique shops in North Carolina, right? So, like thought it was raided. And, this was a Black family who had lived, like that part of my family has lived in this particular part of North Carolina since enduring slavery, right? I'm the first in my line to not be born there, right? And so the idea is that we've lost some important documents. We've lost any kind of real tangible evidence of our relations, of relations who are indigenous, for example. There were photographs of people who were enslaved. And so we are presumably without our archive, but there are things that do not have a kind of physical aspect to them that I have kept, that my family has kept, and are a part of who we are, that remain and are sustaining. And it's incredibly sad. Like, I feel incredible loss for the physical things, like to be able to see, you know, some ancestors' faces that I could have seen, or documents related to their existence that weren't just tick marks on a ledger, you know, like some other kind of proof of their existence. They're I have an iron, my great grandmother's like cast iron downstairs, and I like treasure that thing, like a thing that they touch, that I am touching, right? That's an incredible loss. But we know what it means to have that kind of incredible loss. We've already faced apocalypse. And this is why that feminist lineage of work talks about expecting apocalypse, because we know that we faced it. You know, like it was a moment and a means to an end, and the rupture of the dispersal of Africans via the transatlantic slave trade, that was a moment for people, that was a means to an end, a practice that, you know, was a part of colonialism, and it was just a thing, but it was a rupture. It was the end of the world, the end of language, of relations, of like the next day would never ever be the same as the day before, ever, right? If that's not the end of the world, right? And so we face that. So what can we hold now? And do we, and this is an existential question I have all the time now, like, how do I imagine a future? And knowing that I'm like, it might not be for me. Like it might not, I'm just not. And that's a kind of faith and necessary ritualist practice that we belong to, you know, and so like this is why these images are so incredibly moving, right? Like that we are connected through them in this way. Yeah. And so I just, like, I wonder for you all, how was it, the practice of creating this, right? I'm always curious about artists' creative practice, and touching these ideas, and how you can do that and move through that, knowing what you're tapping into and who you're offering it for. If you can think about who you're offering this for, so like even the imagination of someone will see this in 100 years, I think is so altruistic, and I want it to be true, right? Yeah.
Thank you, Bettina, for this wonderful testimony, which also speaks to the way in which we center our work as intellectuals or as artists, which is to say from our own lived experience. There's so much I want to respond to, Bettina, and I don't know how to do so in a summarized enough fashion so that we may hear Marsha again, specifically as concerned archival forms of bodily reenactment, as can be experienced in Trinidad and Tobago's ongoing public ceremonial practices, festivals, not to immediately mention a carnival, or rather a mass. But so hold on to that, Marsha, because I would like you to address this in conversation with Chris and Arnaldo. But to respond to Chris first and then Bettina. Chris, of course, yes, thank you so much for centering the interim back again in our conversation. And I think that I lost my thought about why, of course, this is Oh, yes, no, I know exactly. There's so many things I want to return to since the very beginning of our conversation, including since Amanda's recognizing and thanking the indigenous caretakers of the land, because there begins, and you refer, Bettina, to the possible indigenous ancestry of your family, which may have been lost through that act of arsonry and that raid, right? And so the act of archiving begins there with the land. And to whom are you returning the Future Black Archive, Chris and Arnaldo, to that very land, which since the beginning has been stewarded by the primary populations of the Americas? So that's the point that I wanted to briefly mention again, to think also about these alliances of which we've been aware, which are nothing new. I mean, which are, among other practices, embodied in the Mardi Indian tradition of New Orleans, to speak of one of the most recent places of diasporic blackness within which I live, but also in many masquerade practices of the mass tradition within the Trinidad Carnival festival. So I wanted to mention this. And then maybe this is not the place, but there's so many references which we share. And if I may bring my own personal reference, I will do so in two ways, and then I will pass again the virtual mic onto Marsha and back to Chris and Arnaldo. You're far luckier than I, Bettina, in terms of your family archive. I don't even know to go as far back as a great grand, a parent. And the last surviving of the Guadeloupean family is my father, who passed away. But I traced 2 years ago, I traced my Guadeloupean lineage through women and through Zora Neale Hurston's recounting of the Okeechobee hurricane from Their Eyes Were Watching God, which of course you, Chris, brought on, and I think you also, Bettina, referred back to. So already, of course, within the configuration of this diasporic blackness in action overseas through our various, current places of residencies, we know how we're, swimming through a sea of common knowledge and reference and experiences of having once faced the apocalypse, as certainly that hurricane of 1928 seemed to be for communities from throughout the Caribbean and up to Florida. And so that is one of the lineage of female ways of feeling and surviving catastrophe, which I traced in one of my essays. But Marsha, back to you and the way in which you may conceive of as the body, of course, as an archive. And, there's an author to whom I like to return, and that's Joseph Roach from Cities of the Dead, and the way in which he speaks of performance as always already a form of reenactment. And when we think about the collective performance that mass is in Trinidad and Carnival throughout the Caribbean and most of the Americas, then we understand how important a form of collective memory that yearly reenactment is. And so I was wondering if you could speak to that, Marsha. And of course, Arnaldo maybe bounce back based on your own experience of mass. And I know, Chris, that you're not at a loss of words and moves as far as that is concerned too. So on to you.
Dr. Pearce, might you allow me?
Yeah, Marsha. Yes.
To just briefly respond before you do.
Sure.
So I was weeping just now listening to Bettina Judd. There's a way you articulated a source from which this work came and my work comes, that is in part a familiarity, though your own personal story is different. That the work, making this, the way that I view marks making, in part is another type of articulation for feelings that we're unable to verbalize. And so, yeah, it left me in tears, but they're complex tears. It's not just sadness. Though there is grieving in there is a happiness. And there's so much, there's just so much you and Claire and Chris and Marsha have spoken to. That is this mesh, this entanglement of of how we archive and carry forward our heritage in day-to-day. I'll pause there. Thank you, Dr. Pearce.
Of course. Thank you for that, Arnaldo. In thinking about, Carnival as it is enacted in the space of Trinidad, we're thinking about, in a sense, it is really about this collective imagining of the self forward, a collective embodiment of imagination that allows a people to continue to move forward. And in that gesture, what you have, to return to that word that we spoke about, this idea of continuum, is a bridging of the physical and the spiritual, right? The body and the spirit, the conscious and the subconscious. So the things that we see that are already there, but the things that we know that are there, but we haven't fully tapped into. So that is the ritual space that Carnival allows, that kind of imagining, that way of seeing. And I think to talk about Carnival in terms of imagination and embodied imagination, or a gesture that allows us to see in a particular way, can really be connected to how we understand what an archive means, because in that sense, this collective becomes an archive. And thinking about it in relation to this exhibition, what do we mean when we say archive? To archive is to register. It is to note, and not just to jot down, or to record, but it is to note in the sense of paying attention to. And so more broadly, to archive Blackness, to me, is to give space and consideration to Blackness in a world of ritualized anti-Blackness. And I'm saying ritualized because in one sense, we could understand ritual as action arising from conventions, actions done in a prescribed way. And so when we think about systemic racism, that comes out of a convention. It is a way of doing things in a particular way, Black negation as convention. So to talk about archiving Blackness, it's really about creating a counter ritual, a gesture that offers another way of doing things, another way of seeing things. And I think the space of Carnival allows for those alternative ways of seeing, of being, of doing, that create paths of possibility for people to be able to move forward. And so that is what is significant. And I think about that in relation to the work that Christopher and Arnaldo are both doing, because to think about imagination and finding other ways of doing things is to invoke the whole idea of transformation. And I think they have both been negotiating this idea of transformation in their work. Christopher witnessing a community in the midst of change and what that means for a people. And in turn, we have Arnaldo using the tools of Carnival, using what it means to play yourself, as we say in Trinidad, to think about transformation. So I would love to hear from Arnaldo and Christopher how they have been thinking about how they've worked through this idea of transformation, this idea of imagination, and so on, as it relates to the show.
Before I pass on to you, Chris and Arnaldo, and possibly to conclude, for it occurs to me that we may be nearing the end, unfortunately, already of our conversation. Marsha, what you just said about Carnival as a counter ritual in what has become this ritualized anti-Blackness, from, of course, the fact of enslavement to lynching, to genocidal action by way of imprisonment, to, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement's reaction to ritual, street, broad daylight killings of Black men, Black men and women and children.
Yes.
It's very powerful, and I think we can already make an appointment for the follow-up to that conversation. And I am not kidding, whether or not it's under the auspices of the Fry or not, but this is really, really, I love the way in which, Marsha, you have turned Carnival into a counter ritual, because in many ways, and I will leave it to you, Chris and Arnaldo, to conclude before we turn back around to our public and take a few questions. We know, for the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, and later on of the COVID pandemic, and the way in which it disproportionately affected Black and Brown communities, to have been central to the making of your work, Chris. And yet, since the beginning of the discussion, we have been all about but celebrating the show, the work, each other, as creative practitioners, also very much in the vein of survivors, which I think speaks volumes as to where we feel we're at as a community. And so, I want to think that the counter ritual to that celebration is, in fact, anti-Blackness, but that our rituals, our masquerading practices, our collective embodiment of self as a people is the ritual, is foundational. But again, we can discuss at length, and I think that that's a whole other discussion unto its own. And, Chris, and maybe you want to go back to mayhap conclude about, the kind of source context for the making of the work. And then Arnaldo, though, you may in turn pick this up and take it to announcing to our audiences what may occur in Trinidad next year as the interim and its record manifests in Trinidad. So that's a lot to you, Chris, and to you, Arnaldo.
Arnaldo will be upset with me with having him go first, but I want you to go first. Maybe just let us a little bit further into the universe of makers that is whose hands come together in shaping whose imaginations collectively like envelop and surface and conjure this work, because that collectivity, I feel like, is really guides where this goes next.
Yeah, so my work is at its core always invested in community. I honestly don't know whose work isn't. We rely on each other to exist. And so I've worked primarily with the assistance of Robert Young on this body of work, who introduced me to a number of other makers from across the breadth of Trinidad. We worked with folks in Toco. I'm not going to get into specific names because I know I will probably omit. So I'm going to speak about it in as many like segments as I can. It's doing that in part, like investing in community, working with folks from this place that I know, allowed all of that work to be organic. And so both in its materiality, like the actual materials used, and in the ideas and the sources for the ideas come from existing here and the stories we all are carrying. So every element, from the cottons and the way that they're stitched, and the patterns and the symbols come from connections that I've been seeking to make in my own life, that I've only been able to do through community, with this ancestral knowledge in part that Dr. Pearce and Judd brought to the conversation. So yeah, Chris, do you wanna jump in a bit? I can speak to as well briefly, talking a bit about the intention for what's going to happen in Trinidad as Claire. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you know, it's I'm thinking about Omen right now. I experience Omen when I encounter your work, and I experience messages, indecipherable messages. I'm thinking about a scripture that Christabel brought up in dialogue with this work as the show is coming together. And Krista made this connection between the veil in the sense of the masquerade, but also the veil in the sense of the window screens. I'll try to scroll back through, but all the paintings that I contribute to the show are painted on these window screens. The window screens and the windows come from a salvage yard, which is next door to the home where I grew up, a place called Jones Glass, where a family of physical archivists of our neighborhood's history have passed down objects from demolished Black neighborhoods. And there's a way that the veils and the window screens, what the scripture that Krista brought up was, for now we see as though through a glass darkly, but then face to face. And it relates to prophecy. It relates to encounters with the creator, with the infinite. It relates to encounters of suspension with the unknowable, and registering, surfacing, experiencing messages from the other side. And seeing, for me, the way that the veil in your works mirrors the way that the screen operates as this interstitial interface, which gives us access to a space that I believe exists outside of time. And I know that there's a lot of conversations about Black creative practice and lineage these days deal with futurity and a kind of a focus on futurity. I'm less I'm less invested in the future as a construct, because I think that there's a way that sometimes the notion of future reinscribes a linear and Eurocentric conception of time into our ways of imagining what the world is and what it becomes. And for me, when I'm encountering your work, and when I receive messages and instructions on what to create or what to store, what to remember, what to hold, it's an experience of a space outside of time, and a feeling that that what this work is offering, that the memories that are coming together, neither degrade nor that they're infinite, and which is not to say that they're unchanging or static, but that they are with us always. And so for me, the necessity of burying these stories, burying the recordings for 100 years is about continuing a lineage of collective remembering, of creating a space outside of time into which people can enter and tell truths that no one living will hear, that no one living can question, and speak in ways that are not shaped or controlled or distorted by the illusion of the now. That opportunity to enter the space, to enter the interim, and theorizing the interim as this sort of pocket dimension, which is always available to us, to me also mirrors what it means to become adorned within the masquerade tradition, to step into and bringing back to Claire's invocation of, the indigenous traditions of the Americas, white suggests us stepping into the ancestral body. Claire, when you brought that up and brought up the hurricane, you brought me back to Florida, where my family is from. And there's all of these sort of temporal harmonics that have been moving through this conversation, a whole other conversation that's been happening with the images and with the messages that goes outside of even what we consciously are realizing that we're speaking to with each other. So I'm just in gratitude, really, for this experience, for the chance to connect. And I know that as we transition to close, it's so frustrating for me, the constraints of time and how they come in and curtail and shape our ways of being able to connect. And so I did ask the Fry if we could, essentially boil over into an informal space that wouldn't have necessarily recording, for people who would like to stay and be in Q&A with us, or just be in dialogue. But I am just in so much gratitude to all of us, to all the loved ones that are living in us and through us here, to all of the stories, to Claire, to your stewardship. There's no one better I could ever imagine. No one more perfectly placed in the universe to bring Arnaldo and I and these stories together. And thank you so much for collaborating with us to imagine and conjure this project. I'm so grateful to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Chris. I know this is only but a benchmark in our long-standing journey. I am so delightful to have been able to rekindle with Marsha and to have been able to discover Bettina. And that when I say that this conversation will have at least a part 2, whether or not under the auspices of the Fry, at Fry, you might want to host this. I really, really mean it, because, we might not have done ourselves so much of a disservice by not being in the same room at the same time. It simply means that we need to find ways to be together, and it might well be, if not in Seattle, then maybe in Port of Spain. So I finally tuned into the comments. I'm so sorry, I was not paying attention. I was just looking at the 5 screens here, but there's like upward to 100 comments out there. And so, Amanda, how do we take it from there? Do we still have time to take questions, or how do we do? I'm turning back to the institution hosting us, which I thanked earlier in writing, but want to thank again, because it was not easy stewarding us. And
all the different time zones, yes.
Thank you for making it through, and the entire staff at the Fry, to whom we're really collectively and individually grateful. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all of you. That was a just like fabulous presentation and conversation. Amazing. I don't think that, well, I think most of the comments in the chat were just, like comments and celebrations, but there is one question in the Q&A from Krista Bell. Do you want to take that one question? And then,
sure. Yes.
Okay, so she says, Bettina and Arnaldo and Marsha, can you speak to the land, indigeneity, and the place the formerly enslaved might occupy ideologically as new indigenous? Land acknowledgements got me triggered these days, and I've been sitting with the idea of when does indigeneity begin? And also, how does our landlessness, homelessness speak within the archive? So she's responding here to the notion of ritualized anti-Blackness. So I don't know who wants to take that on. It could be.
Well, I want to say that in a way, yeah, it's. And I will let those who were addressed to answer, but in a way, it is a question which contains its many answers therein, in as much as, of course, the answers also lies within ourselves. But to those to whom the questions was addressed, I guess it's a awesome lot.
I'm really interested, and I do not mean to be familiar and volunteer you, Dr. Pearce, but I'm really interested in what your response to this would be, because I feel like there is much more said, particularly around the ritual of Carnival and its relationship to indigeneity than perhaps we have an open conversation about, within the U.S. outside of, say, New Orleans specifically, right?
Thank you.
And so I am interested in how you would, think about this question.
Well, I think what I would want to do is to flip this notion of landlessness, and that's not to dismiss it, but to find another way of thinking about it, and to think about what it means to be landful. And by that, I mean to understand the land in itself as an archive, that the land is a site of memory in and of itself, and that memory extends beyond, for example, when we think about Trinidad and Tobago, and we talk about being independent at a certain particular time, or we talk about the arrival of Christopher Columbus at a particular time, and we use that as starting points for history. We have to understand that the land knows, a much earlier time than that, than these dates that we give, in terms of how we think about the historiography or the writing, or how we understand time and place and so on. And so I think it's to start from an understanding of the land as being a place that has a memory. For us to be able to acknowledge that, as I said, in terms of thinking about what it means to be landful or landfulness, before we even think about ourselves as being dispossessed from it, And I think Carnival allows for that kind of opportunity, as I said earlier, for countering those conventional ways of knowing, right? It creates that ritual space for, as I said, looking in a different way and doing in a different way. And so it is perhaps that space, because of course, when we think about Carnival, Carnival is that reclaiming of the space. We know that for many of you who may not have participated, of course, we here in Trinidad and Tobago, we're driving on the streets, we use the roads in very particular ways, conventional ways. But when it's Carnival time, the space is reclaimed, the land is reclaimed in a particular way that, goes outside the boundaries of the everyday. And so I think it really has to start from a place of thinking about how we resituate our understanding of the land. An understanding of hope, if that makes sense.
So thank you for that, Dr. Pearce. Christabel. Woo! So I have a number of thoughts. I'm not saying they're all gonna gel. Please bear with me. Yes, there's a way when we revel, and a number of ways that we describe claiming public space, that it shifts some of the modalities that we've inherited through Eurocentric thinking and European occupation of our space. One of the things I always remember in a history class with the late Pat Bishop was her reflecting on the ways that indigenous folks taught about land. And of course, these can be a very generalized statement. But amongst those consciousness that I was introduced to was that the land cannot be owned, that everyone has access. What we're being co-opted, conditioned, and policed into is this ownership that is framed, certainly from an extractive and segregated approach. And so with holding that amongst the consciousness that the land is not, cannot be owned, or in fact is communally accessible, I'm engaging more with what I often describe as a psychological warfare, which is this conditioning reinforcement that there's a time and place for how we share space. I feel free to ask me any questions to flesh out that, because I'm having a number of thoughts bumping against each other as I'm tossing with what Christabel put forward.
Well, there's another thorny question if you want to redirect into that. And it is from Joyce Lee.
Hi, Joyce.
Let me just find it now. How can or will the Black archive exist outside of oppression? Because we will not always be in invisible chains, but we will always need to memorialize ancestry. Whoever wants to take that on.
For y'all who are here who don't know who these people are who are asking us these questions,
They're supposed to be your friends, right?
The people who are here, no, they're definitely our friends. They're definitely our friends. And have pulled y'all have pulled me through. But I'm just offering to the people who, just due to the limitations of this platform, are the people who are speaking to us right now. I need you to understand. There's no skating around the challenges of this question. Joyce, how does the Black archive exist outside of oppression? So I'm gonna walk into this just through, I think, a feeling that I sense from the other question, which is a question about, for me, essentially about how do we know who we are? And because when and where we know who we are and what it means for us as Black people to know who we are is essentially to love who we are. And that love coming to shape and coming to life in us through practice, through connection, through community, through our presence with one another. Where two or three are gathered, there I am in the midst. these spiritual principles, which traverse many different traditions of knowing, of being, of understanding our relationship to the infinite. For me, that's the work, and everything else is kind of like, and it overflows from that space. So how do we just get together and love on each other? When, where do we get to do that?
Chris,
That's what I'm interested in.
Chris or Amanda, unless you you prompt us to answering another a question, maybe as an offering for a conclusion and a response to both Christabel and Joyce's question, and also to Marsha's offering of the notion of landfulness. So much resides within the body. Landfulness is within the body. It is first and foremost the body which carries literally, physically, materially pieces of the land from across the ocean. This is that thanks to which we're able to nurture ourselves. We know the stories of seeds that were embedded within within hair and to be planted on American soil and to continue literally nurturing ourselves physically. So I think that landfulness is cited within the body. And I also think that landfulness is a common feature of this diasporic historical consciousness, as I like to think of it, which goes counter to claims of nationhood and property, to return to that which Arnaldo was referring to, of course, and what Amanda, of course, in her a statement very well phrased as institution do, which is that indigenous communities are the first to be, of course, aware of the stewardship rather so than the ownership that they can have toward the land. So I want to think of the body in a way as an answer to a lot of these questions, even as the body is that which continues to be attacked literally through disease and death and various forms of genocidal action. And then, but really finally, and not to sound corny, but I want to say that the space where the Black archive may reside outside oppression is art. It is and will continue to be artistic forms of expressions, embodied or immaterial. And I think that is the place.
Super ending, Claire. That was amazing. Thank you so much. I guess we should end there. I'm going to look to my colleagues, Yasmin and Michelle, for any guidance as to whether we're able to create a space for people to sort of hang around offline and talk outside of the webinar.
Actually,
format.
you know what? I have an after party link for anybody who wants to join. I just generated another Zoom room because I would love to see people's faces anyway.
Chris was not even supposed to be here. Chris was supposed to be sick. Chris was supposed to be like, and Chris is for the party link now, you see?
Yeah, so I just put the after party link in the chat. No pressure to anyone, but for people who do want to see each other's faces and be in dialogue, that is there. There's really no reason to feel limited.
It surely is party time here in Paris. It's midnight.
Oh my gosh. Thank you so much, Claire, for...
So I'm going to dismiss myself to enable myself to be in there, but y'all know I love you.
Okay, well, I'll just wrap it up by reminding everyone that In the Interim is open at the Fry until May 15th, through May 15th. So come and see it if you are in the area and are able. And there's also a Community Day program on May 14th, which celebrates In the Interim, as well as other exhibitions we have on. So take care. Thank you again to all of our panelists and for all the great responses in the chat. And yeah, hope to see you at a Fry event again soon.